Hello there, my old friends. My name is Father Martin, and tonight I will be telling you the story of Arrietty and her paintings. But before I do that, I would like to explain what has happened with Seth Lewis. The truth is, I don't know, at least not yet. Right now, whatever is going to happen to him, whether he stays up in the UFO or is brought back down to Earth, is being decided. But since these videos are made in advance, you won't be able to find that out until Wednesday. I sure hope that he's going to be alright. I think that you all are probably concerned too, although maybe a few of you think it'd be better off if he's up there in space, but no, I'd miss seeing him around the library. But this story is going to be told with accuracy in mind. We're not interested in storytelling, we're just interested in the history. So, Arrietty was a little girl who adored painting. Her entire life was built around it, and she would often, when she was just only actually 3 years old, put her fingers into the paint, and she would draw little artwork on the walls and crown for her parents, and they were angered by this. But she adored it so much that her parents decided to encourage her craft. When her father got a day off from work, he would take her down to the Sistine Chapel, and she would look up at the works of Michelangelo, the gods and the angels and the demons, and she would tell him that the paintings were singing to her. The paintings were singing to her, and he would smile at her as he held her in his hands. Now, her mother thought that she would begin to move away from art when she got older, but this was not the case, for when she reached the age of 7, she was as much obsessed as she had been when she was 4, and she would come home with her paint dripping out of her backpack, or it all across her clothes, and she got in trouble quite a lot for this by her teachers. And sometimes she would come down from her room and there would be specks of paint all over her face, until finally her parents thought they needed a place for her to set up shop where she wouldn't destroy the house. So they put her up in the attic. And it may seem strange that two parents would allow their daughter to play around in the attic by herself, but Arrietty was already showing herself to be a very mature girl, and also it was a different time, so they didn't really think anything of it. But she would make so many works. She made things that really came from a little girl's imagination, like carousels or fairies or gardens, little places for her to go, or a fantasy world. And sometimes, while she was working, she would think that she saw a thing in the paintings. A fating thing is what she would later describe it as. It was like a shadow, but she was never able to put her finger on exactly what it was or where it was, so she thought it was her imagination. But one night she was working, and she was thinking to herself that she was going to make a work like her heroes Dali or Bosch or Vincent van Gogh or Pablo Picasso. But as she was at her work, she noticed that she was drawing something she hadn't intended to draw. She looked and she saw that it was a door, and she thought to herself that was strange, but as she peered closer she realized that the door was peeking out of the canvas. And she couldn't believe it. She put her fingers between it and realized that it was coming open, and that the door was actually a door into her canvas. She pulled it open and she looked in and saw that there was a wilderness out there. Well, anyways, her curiosity was ignited, and she put out one finger and touched where the wilderness would be, and she realized that her finger was stuck in there, and that the paint was coming down her finger in little red and blue droplets. And then she reached further in, and then all at once there was a bunch of color and sound, and she felt like screaming. It was so much, and it was making her so dizzy. Felt like she was going someplace that she wasn't supposed to be going. And then all at once she landed with a thud, and she looked around and she realized that she was in the wilderness. She didn't know this, but the canvas had actually fallen on top of her, and that is how she got in there. But she looked down at herself, and she had her canvas bag full of painting utensils, so she was lucky in that regard. But she looked around, and she realized that many of the trees in this forest had faces on them, etched on them. But their eyes were closed, and as she listened, she noticed that they were snoring. And she couldn't believe it. But she went up to one tree, and she was very hesitant about it, but finally she touched it very gently. And the tree at once opened its eyes and looked down at her. "What, girl, why do you wake me up like that? I was sleeping." And the girl said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I was just wondering where I am." "You're in the wilderness," said the tree. "Now let me go back to sleep." And it closed its eyes, and it began snoring again. And she felt a little offended by how rude the tree had been to her, but as she looked over, she saw that there was a creature passing by. And she went and she hid behind a bush, for it was a giant black cat, a house cat, but it had many eyes. And as it walked by, it stopped for a moment and licked its paws and looked around as if it knew Arrietty was there, and she had to go back down deep into the bush. And then finally, the cat walked away. Anyway, she realized that she would have to be much more careful from this point on, and she walked down the trail. And she went for some time screaming for help and wondering where exactly she was, before she arrived at a clearing, and there she saw a sight that seemed completely out of place. It was a long stretch of board that stretched as far as she could see. And on this board were carousel horses, with poles sticking out of their bellies, and they were quite beautifully painted. But as she walked up, she heard a voice. "My dear ma'am, if you want to use those horses, you must get on one and yell out where you want to go. I see that you look a little confused." She looked around, and she didn't see anything except a weirdly shaped bush that was all brown. And anyway, she said, "Who's there?" "I am," said the voice. And as she continued to look at the bush, she realized that it had a top hat on its head, and it had big wide eyes and a goofy smile. And she realized it was a furry beast of some sort. And she was afraid, but she said, "Who exactly are you?" "Oh," said the creature, "I'm not civilized enough to have a name, but I am a creature that resides here in this wilderness, and I have been here many a long year, wishing I could go back to the kingdom of elsewhere." And anyways, tears began to fall from his eyes, and she said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you. You see, I'm a stranger in these parts. I was looking for my home. Somehow I fell down into this world, a world that I believe that I was painting somehow, although there's so many things here that look unfamiliar from anything that I created." And the creature said, "You're a maker of worlds? Never heard of such a thing. Well, I can tell you somebody who might be able to help you, the kingdom of elsewhere. They have some of the smartest people there that know everything and that can get anything done. And if you ever need any help, they say that the best place to go is there. But I'm afraid I probably couldn't go. After all, I was booted out of there when I was just too clumsy, and I put things in all the wrong places. I was punished repeatedly until finally I was banished." And anyways, the creature looked down and said, "Oh, well, that's horrible," said Arrietty. I don't think you should have been banished. And if you don't think you're civilized, well, maybe I could help you." "Really?" said the creature. "Well, I've always wanted a name." And Arrietty thought about it, and she remembered her painters that she loved so much, and said, "Your name shall be Bosch, a Vincent Bosch." And the creature said, "Vincent Bosch? It's an odd name, but I shall take it. Now, little girl, I see you're confused about these horses. A lot of creatures are. Most of them stay within their kingdoms and never go out riding. But these horses come to anyone who needs them. And they take you to different places in this world. Come." And he got on top of one of them, and she did as well. All you have to do is shout the name, and they shall ride you forward. But the carousel horses, they can't move on their own, can they? And he said, we'll give it a try. And she said, all right, the kingdom of elsewhere. And then the horses began to move all on their own, and began going down the long board, and he said, ah, good. This might take a little while. They don't always come to creatures that need them, but sometimes they manage to find you if they're not busy somewhere else. Anyways, Arrietty was taken on one of the strangest merry-go-rides she would ever go on. Bosch began to explain to her all about the regions that they were traveling through, and she saw quite a few sights. The first place they went was a giant desert, and he pointed out to her a bunch of stone giants, and he explained, this is the savage land. No one ever goes here or fear being stamped to death by those creatures. Arrietty looked at them with a little bit of fear, but they kept moving on, and then they came to a sandy beach. There were all sorts of seashells, and there were all sorts of objects strewn across the beach. Arrietty herself saw some clocks, and some eggs, and some frying pans, and a rocking chair, and all sorts of weird objects. But Bosch explained to her, down there is where the under people live. They live in this glass dome beneath the sea. And they are a very lazy sort of people. No one ever bothers with them, and they themselves don't bother with themselves, for there's a huge crack in their dome that they never try and fix, despite the fact that it could end their lives. Arrietty thought that this was a most unusual place. As they continued journeying on, she explained where she came from, and it didn't seem like Bosch believed half of it. But when she came to talking about death and things like that, Bosch said, well, here in our world we don't have such a thing, but we have something like it. There is this black creature that roams this world, and it takes away beings once they've reached a certain age, or once they've outserved their purpose, and then a new creature will walk in its stead. It doesn't happen very often, but I've known it to occur occasionally. Anyways, eventually they started riding towards the palace, and it seemed so big and beautiful to her with all these stone castles, and it looked like something from a fantasy book, a medieval place. And they rode up to it, and finally the horses stopped, and she jumped off. And as they walked forward, there wasn't any real gates or any guards, but she began to see all sorts of creatures passing by. I could talk for hours about all the things she saw. There were these flower people, and there was these people made out of vegetables. And Bosch warned her not to steal a tomato, for he said, the last person that did that was never seen from again. Anyways, Arrietty reminded herself to never take a vegetable off the vegetable people's bodies. She also saw these long white men, and she also saw humans that looked exactly like her. And Bosch began to explain that all the creatures here served a certain purpose. Each of them did a certain task. And the pawns were the most overworked creatures of them all. And she saw one pass by, very fast. It happened with just a blur. And he explained that it was probably going off to send some message. The pawns are the laborers here. They do all the business. Arrietty said, oh, I happened to notice that many of them are sad and seem to be crying. Indeed, all the creatures that they had passed by had been crying as they did their work, and Bosch explained, yes, they're all quite miserable. It is hard to live in such a world, but such a world is what's been created. Well, anyways, Arrietty didn't know what to think of this. She felt a little bit sad for all of these creatures, but soon enough they reached the king's tower, and they came up to a soldier there that was in fact human. And the soldier had a big feather on his hat, and he had big wide eyes and little spectacles on his nose, sort of like mine. And the man looked up and said, who be you, and why do you come to our castle? And Arrietty said, my name is Arrietty, and I'm lost. I was hoping the king or one of your people might be able to help me get back to my own home. And Jan van Eyck began to look at her, and he walked over, and he began to look beneath her ear, and he began to look at her hair, and he began to look at her hands and everything, and he finally said, "You girl are a complete mess. Look at you. There's paint clips all over your face and all on your hands. Why, that is no way for a little girl to behave." Anyway, she said, I am sorry. I'm kind of lost, you see, and I fell through a painting, and I haven't been able to think much about my appearance." Well, anyways, the general said, "I don't know if you know this, but my name is Jan van Eyck, and you must be getting to work right immediately. You will be a guard here, if you like. Now, I will show you your station." "Oh, but I don't want to be a guard. I want to be out." "What?" said Jan van Eyck. "Not doing your work? Us creatures here work every single moment of every single day, trying to make ourselves better, trying to reach towards the sky and make the fading one, or whatever that thing is, happy." And anyway, she stopped, and she thought to herself that she had remembered this fading thing from her own paintings, and she realized that many of the things from her own work was indeed there, but not all of them. There were things that had been built that she had never even thought of. But anyways, Jan van Eyck said, "Look here, girl, either you do this soldier work, or you will be terminated. I shall have you executed." Anyway, she said, "Oh no, I don't want to be executed. Please, stop yelling at me." And she started to back up, and by her misfortune, she backed up into a pillar with a bowl of fruit on it. And it fell down onto the ground, and it scattered everywhere, and all of the guards let out a yell, and even many of the pawns in the city stopped and let out a scream, as well as many of the citizens, all realizing what had happened. And she looked at Bosch and said, "What's wrong?" And Bosch said, "Oh dear, I never thought you would have done it. You have misplaced an object. That pillar and that bowl of fruit is always supposed to stay there, as are many of the other things here. You can't be going and putting things in the wrong places. I would have thought you would have known at least that." And anyways, Arrietty looked up at Jan van Eyck, who yelled, "You shall be executed in the morning! Take her down into the dungeons!" Well, anyways, she was dragged down, and poor Arrietty was very sad, and Bosch was with her. She was again fortunate, for the bag of paint stuff was looked at by the guards, but they had no idea what it was, and thought it must be some kind of a weird fruit or something harmless to them. They had never seen painting before, because they never did such frivolous activities. But anyways, as she cried, Bosch did his best to hug her, and he gave her the warmest hug he could, and said, there, and she said, "Oh, Bosch, I'm so frightened. They're going to kill me in the morning." "No," he said. "Like I said, they can't kill you. When they say executed, they mean that the painted beast is going to eat you up, and it will probably be very painful for you, but you won't die. I don't think Jan van Eyck is as bad of a man as he tries to pretend he is. He'd never hurt her, or at least kill a little girl, or take it to the Dark One." Well, anyways, Arrietty didn't know what to think of this, although she realized later that maybe Jan van Eyck, if he could have killed her, would have. But anyways, as she sat there, she heard a voice. "Excuse me, miss. I couldn't help but notice that you were sad. Don't be. I have been here a very long time." And she turned around, and she saw that there was a man etched out on the wall, and the man had chains on him, and said, "You see, the creatures here couldn't find any purpose for a thing on the wall, and they finally decided to put me down in the dungeon, since I didn't have much of a place in their world." And Arrietty walked up and said, "Oh, that's so horrible. How long have you been here?" "Thousands and thousands of years," said the man, "and I would also like a bite to eat." And she said, "Well, I have just the thing." And she reached down to her canvas, and she painted him a wonderful apple, and she put it down into his mouth, and he gobbled it up and said, "Why, that's delicious. I've never seen a creature able to do that." "Yes," she said, "but it has given me an idea. If I can paint myself in, maybe I can paint myself out." And she began to take her paintbrush, and she painted herself a door, and she imagined that it was a door back to her room. And sure enough, when she grabbed the doorknob, she was able to pull it open, and she could see her room there and all of her stuff. But then she closed it and said, "This gives me an idea." And Bosch said, "What do you mean? You need to go back to your home." And she said, No, I don't think it's very good the way these creatures have treated you, and I'm going to fight to make it so that you creatures don't always have to work yourselves to death all the time. I'm going to paint my way out of this." She looked down at the paintbrush, and Bosch seemed confused, but she promised him it would all make sense the next day. Well, anyways, the next day arrived, and all of the creatures were sitting there in the stadium, and Jan van Eyck was sitting there, as well as was the king, who, with his big white beard and his large glasses, larger than a head, was looking down and waiting for the excitement. And Arrietty was brought out, and Jan van Eyck said, "All right, miss, I'll give you a chance to ask for forgiveness. If you beg for it, I will not release the painted one." And she said, "No, thank you. I would love to see this painted one, and I believe that I will stamp it out of existence." And Bosch said, "What are you doing, you fool? I've had my quarrels with this creature. You don't want to fight it." But Arrietty kept her head high, and Jan van Eyck said, "Very well, release the painted one." And the painted one came out, and it was much like a worm with feathers on its head and big eyes, and there were all these ruby glass windows on its side, and these little creatures staring out of those windows. And the creature let out a loud screech, and Arrietty did have to admit she was rather frightened, especially seeing as how many legs and how many different shoes were on this beast. And as it came forward, she reached down into her pack and pulled out some lacquer thinner, and she threw it at the creature. And all at once it began to dissolve its jaws, and it let out a screaming whimper. And all the creatures began to mumble amongst themselves. They had never seen such a thing, and she said, "All right, if I continue, it will kill this beast." Anyways, they all the stadium began to mumble amongst themselves, and the creature tried to attack her again, but she just threw some more on it, and it hurt it. And finally Jan van Eyck said, "No, wait, you are some kind of god or something. Please have mercy on us and don't kill us. Do what you want with the painted beast, but please do not harm our families." And they bent their heads, and she said, "Oh, don't worry, everything will be all right." And she repainted the jaw to the painted beast and said, "You see, here it is. It's fine. And I want you all to know that I'm here to help you. I think that you all have worked yourselves rather to death, and you need to take a break for a little while." And all the creatures began to mumble amongst themselves, and finally Jan van Eyck said, "We shall do anything that you command. Please just help us." And Arrietty thought about this and realized that that means she would have to give away her ticket home. But she realized that these creatures did need a lot of help, and there was much more here at stake than her, so she agreed. And we will find out whether her paintings get her into any trouble or not. But until then, sweet dreams and good night. May you not find yourself falling into your paintings, because, well, there might be more trouble than it's worth.